Today I'm talking with Prashanthi Raman. She's advisor to co-founder at Rula Health, and before that, she led global government work at Cruise and Lyft. And earlier in her career, she worked in the Illinois governor's office in health policy. She's also a Northwestern alum and serves on their alumni admissions council and the Farley Center advisory board. So, what stood out to me the most about this conversation was the way she represented and brought out her identity, her love of community, and even her background in Carnatic music into the way that she leads and communicates and works in the government as well as health. So this conversation felt way less like an interview and more like sitting down with someone who's really wise and knows how to connect big ideas with real people and make meaningful conversation out of it. So it was a great conversation. I hope you enjoy. How's it going?
Okay, how are you?
Pretty good. Thank you so much for coming onto this podcast. I think we're pretty similar in that I'm also really interested in policy and law specifically. And I guess sort of to start things off, could you describe your transition from the private to the public sector as you went from like a law firm working in the healthcare aspects of law to like the office of the Illinois governor?
You bet. Well, thanks for having me, first of all. I am so appreciative of the work that you are doing to augment people of our community and hear about our stories. So really for me, from a private sector to public sector leap, was one matter of passion and two, a matter of serendipity. I was always interested in health policy and policy in general, is what I majored in, and then went on to get a JD and PH, really to do legislation of policy, particularly in the healthcare field. And so while I was working at the law firm and in and out of in-house roles, I also really kept up on the side a lot of my conversations in the political policy space, which led me to an opening at the governor's office, of which I was appointed into by the governor of Illinois at that time, Pat Quinn, to run his legislative affairs for the healthcare portfolio. And so in that role, I oversaw 8 healthcare agencies and passed small and big pieces of legislation and really started to understand the Venn diagram intersection of people, policy, and politics. And a lot of my legal career really helped shape my critical thinking, my ability to negotiate language in real time, my ability to write succinctly and comprehensively at the same time, and allow the governor to be briefed on certain matters of expertise, as well as policy issues and identifying issues of where there would always be contention and how to resolve them.
That's really great. So like blending all those different skills into these jobs. So like how would you say you blended your like some cultural values that you gained growing up as an Indian American kid sort of with this like organizational work and like dealing with people, dealing with these societal level like challenges? I guess how would you blend your like Indian cultural wisdom with this practicality and like how has being Indian American been like your secret superpower in your career?
So I think that my secret power has been relationship building and the fact that I'm firstborn generation. I had to have a lot of resilience and hard work attached to everything I did. And so when it came to be that there was a barrier or there was a hard point in the negotiation, or it was really a daunting and exhausting process in the governor's office, or pretty much throughout my career, I really dug deep in some of the fundamental values of our community, which was the hard work aspect, which was thinking intellectually as well as with our emotions of, emotional aptitude, thinking about really developing trusting relationships. So like always truth telling, really being the best we can be. And so that meant a lot of hard work, a lot of long hours, a lot of discussions and thoughtfulness on how to meet people where they were, in terms of where their background is and what their cultural values were that often shaped where they're going to come in on their decision. And so for me, the being Indian American became that superpower because I came with a level of understanding of what it meant to struggle, what it meant to see people who came from nothing to be built into something like our parents did, and also to be able to understand the privilege that I then sat in because of them, to be able to then shape policies that could affect the generations to come. And I think that was really important because you can see sort of the range and the spectrum of the immigrant life into the future of what the reason that they came here for was to give us a better life.
So yeah, so like using sort of like your knowledge about immigration, about different cultures, about adapting, about like these different things in American society to sort of like kind of motivate what you're like presenting and like the different plans you have for Illinois for your job. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, so I guess like diving deeper into that part of like knowing these values, how would you sort of describe your experience like growing up as an Indian American kid? Like what was school like? What was
Mhm.
college like? Like when did you know what career you wanted to pursue? Things like that.
Sure. I grew up in a smaller town in the suburbs of Chicago. It was actually pretty homogenous from my racial diversity perspective, probably low to middle class in terms of socioeconomic status. And so I was sort of different from the beginning, from everyone who was around me. I had a dad who wore a lungi and out in public to get the mail. And so I had to sort of deal with why is your dad wearing a skirt kinds of questions. And, my parents had an accent and I came smelling like masala and garam masala in the morning. And so it was very difficult to acclimate into those from a social aspect, because you always had a sort of this east-west tension, growing up. But I think what really helped in the future was the grounding of the values and really the family being the center in order to kind of motivate me and to help me have something to back myself up on when I had some challenges at school. But I always knew academics was number one. I think that is a shared value across many Indian families. And so my sister's 8 years older than me, was pursuing medicine. My brother, who's 6 years older than me, was pursuing engineering. And I thought I needed to go into medicine. So I actually applied to all colleges with pre-med, bio, and got a bunch of scholarships based on that. But it was fundamentally, my first year at college where I realized I didn't want to be a doctor. That wasn't really my life passion. And my father said, "Well, what are you going to major in?" And he never understood what is social policy. And he didn't really get that. And I had to prove to him that it was actually meaningful for the value of what she was paying for. And so I had to work really hard. I had to show sort of the work that I was doing and what my future goals were. And so I sometimes think like as Indian Americans, particularly firstborn generation, we kind of had to think several steps ahead to show sort of what our vision was for our lives, just like our parents did when they thought about fighting to come here in the first place with their own parents. And so I think that is uh, something that remained with me throughout my childhood.
Yeah, definitely. I think like the weight of the expectations and also sort of like a little bit of like a societal model minority stereotype that sort of like influences certain paths in Indian American lives is I think definitely very understated and also very prevalent. And I guess on what you said earlier about like your like experience in your childhood, like living in an area where there weren't many people who look like you and sort of like the east versus west tension. I guess what would you say is something that maybe like your non-Indian friends would find fascinating or like cool about your culture when they would like come to your house when you were a kid?
Why we had an elephant head statue always at the beginning. Right? So you really had to explain like Ganesha and Hindu mythology. And I think they found that fascinating. Like most kids, they're fascinated by cartoons and sort of the
Yeah.
heroes and superheroes and sort of that aspect, right? And so I think having a Hindu mythology to pull on, they always found that extraordinarily fascinating. They also, frankly, thought that the food was really interesting. You know, my mom would cook some matar paneer or for South Indian dosa and sambar to be able to showcase what different foods were taste like. And that was something that they really appreciated or sometimes didn't really like. And I think that was a fascination. I also think as we got a little bit older into sort of our teenage years, where people were becoming a little bit more open-minded, really fascinated with my both of my parents' stories of why they came here and how they came here.
Yeah, and I think especially like obviously there is a lot of like prejudice stereotypes about Indian people that exist, but I think specifically kids and teenagers experiencing a new culture is something that's uniquely like very liberating and very positive for Indian people. Like for me, I had a Diwali party in November and I invited like all several non-Indian friends of mine, and they all wore like I dressed all of them up in Indian clothes. Like they all tried the food. It was honestly just like a very like new and cool thing to just like try out. And I think that I also experienced that when I like will try out another culture, like see something else that I have don't recognize. So I think that that's a really positive part of like sort of engaging with new cultures, engaging with things that you haven't seen before. And I think that that is truly like a unique thing that kind of stands above all of the prejudice, all of the stereotypes, all of like the model minority stuff that exists.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, and I guess like throwing that back to you, like what would you say are like you're most optimistic about as you're like raising your children in the America of today? And like what would you say maybe concerns you most, like comparing your childhood when you were a kid versus now, kind of at, like from the parent perspective?
So I think from the positive aspect, I think we're not new anymore. We're not this, nugget of what is this? We're not, we're not sort of like the new statue in the exhibit of the museum. And I think because of that, there's also more representation for all of us throughout their youth. And I think that helps sort of feel like you're part of the larger society, which I think was just different for us growing up. We just were a little bit adjacent to it, based on how the community that we grew up in. I also think, frankly, hilariously enough, we're like now trendy to Ganesh is now trendy, like the Hindu sign, the Om sign is now trendy, yoga is now trendy. And so some of these pieces have now become interwoven into the larger society, the fabric of the American culture. And so there's a lot more embracing of it and a more openness to understanding it. And even with the subcultures in the Indian community, more people are interested in sort of intermingling and sort of intersecting and mixing things up. And I think so. I really feel like the benefit of being so much more open-minded is really going to take our culture further. At the same time, we had that East-West divide and we had language and we had a lot of the cultural and the religious aspects baked into our everyday. And I fear, and I would say this is my biggest concern, is that I'm watching that be diluted generation to generation. And all the beauty and the spirituality and the grounding nature of the Indian community values that come from that we had, I fear that that might be lost, including our language, including whatever language we speak, whether it's North Indian or South Indian or Hindi or Gujarati or Telugu or Tamil. Some of that is being lost as the generations go on. And so you're going to start to see a generational information divide that might be lost forever because there isn't that sort of translating medium anymore. So I would say some of the culture might go extinct in a way, because there's not an opportunity to really carry some of that forward.
Yeah, and I think another thing sort of like contributing to that extinction is like the commodification and like exoticism that goes along with like Indian cultural symbols and products. So like yoga, the Om symbol, all of these things are becoming like glorified and integrated into like a broader European and Americanized like culture to the point where they're being commodified and sold as products rather than like traditional knowledge that can be like reproduced by Indians. So like the patenting of Bikram yoga, things like that. I think those are all certain mechanisms that are like kind of dividing, creating another division, the division between like the Indian person and like the Indian symbols and the Indian culture. And I think that that is another thing like really contributing to this decline that you're pointing out.
Yeah,
I,
and I also one thing I would also say, just turning back to the benefits aspect though, Shobh, is like there's a lot about the Indian culture that needed to be changed. The sort of the patriarchal nature, some of it being very paternalistic, a lot more male dominated. There's an opportunity to change all of that. And I think I look forward to, seeing the work that our generation has done to get past some of those things and to further them. And while at the same time understanding that, to your point, a lot of you don't want to get it too out there so that you lose the spirit and the nature of the essence of being Indian. And so I think there's a fine balance that we're continuing to try to pursue.
yeah, I think definitely like adjusting the certain like problematic parts of the culture while also like trying to preserve its stability towards and its connectedness to Indian culture
Right.
is like a very important balance to have. What would you say is kind of like because you specifically mentioned like language as something that's sort of like declining as generations pass on. So what would you say is like a sociological and like social policy perspective? What would you say is a way to fight against that?
I think part of it is just people learning and speaking the language that they know. And while grandparents are still around, having them solely speak to them in a language. And it can be nuanced, right? It doesn't have to be this whole immersion program. It can be where you just learn foods in that language and you also learn different sayings in that language and you learn how to start a bhajan or go to the temple and some of the slokas that we perform. Basic tenets of whether that's Sanskrit to a certain family language that's spoken in the home. Some of it is just things that I think are getting lost, or frankly, dare I say, anglicized in a way where even the pronunciation is being butchered. So I think the more and kids are so sponges, so the more you talk to them in the language and with the proper pronunciation, the more likely they're able to keep it and start to inculcate that into their lessons and then hopefully move that forward. It really wasn't until college when I met other South Asians and so many of them that I started to really understand the beauty of what Indian American life is like. And I found people who spoke Telugu along with me. I hadn't spoken Telugu in years, other than going back to India in the summer. And we would just start busting out Telugu in the middle of classes or library or wherever we were hanging out. And it became a kind of a bond in a way that I hope, whoever and however the next generations continue to carry that forward will also be able to experience.
Yeah, I think that language, like other than communication in with like people who know the language, it is like a form of kind of connection in a place where you don't like in sort of like an unknown place. So like connecting with people and like finding out like, oh, he speaks the same language as me, or like seeing that is definitely like kind of like a very comforting feeling. And I guess like what advice more on that point, what advice, specific advice would you give to Indian American youth like myself living in like the Bay Area? Yeah, just interested in like politics, like stuff like this. Sort of like what would you tell maybe your 16-year-old self?
About being Indian American or being about politics. Those are two
Um,
different things.
no, yeah, I started describing myself, but like just yeah, just like Indian American youth like myself. Like what would you just sort of like general general advice, general like thoughts if you have like a
I think
conversation?
you all have an opportunity to be curious, to really open your lens of curiosity in a way that our generation just wasn't exposed to, or really, frankly, allowed to in many ways. I'll say I'm speaking in generalities, and there might be, certain people who have a different experience and a very specific experience that might be different. But, I think there's like a joke that you either become a doctor or an engineer, in our generation, and then maybe sometimes a lawyer. And I think the opportunity to really think big is something I would definitely advise to the youth of today, because you're not grounded by something that equals stability, financial stability, in the same way it meant those careers were meant to our parents and that generation of immigrants. And so I think there's an opportunity really to like showcase the skill sets and develop passions that weren't otherwise really thought about or really cultivated. I'd also say, not only from a curiosity lens from what you want to be, is a curiosity lens of like where you came from. Really understand the culture and the history and the family tree and the lineage that you all were from, because that's the only way we're going to pass it forward, is if we learn from where we came from in the past, the good and the bad, right? And I think that's something that you can bring forward within policy discussions, within debate arguments, within, whatever passions that you're pursuing from a skill set. And finally, like the fundamental value, I think, crosses all Indian Americans, um, is this concept of hard work. Like the more work that you put into something, the harder you practice, like you will get it and you will be successful. And it might take different roads to be there, because not every process is linear. But most of us have the talent, the raw talent to really cultivate and be honed into something successful as long as you work hard.
Yeah, so just like hold your history, hold your culture, hold all of that near and dear to you, not only so that you can like use it to influence your future perspectives and thoughts that you share as you like progress in the world, but also to like pass on to future generations to like
Yeah,
preserve the culture.
right. And change the world.
Yeah.
We're just starting to sort of be in these spaces where we're being recognized and as change makers. And I think there's a whole world of opportunity for this next generation to take that even further.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely agree with you. And I think it all starts with conversations and it starts with storytelling.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, even in the fundamental world of public engagement and government affairs, the most influential lever are people's stories. That's
Yeah.
how you get people to change your mind.
Yeah. And that's actually like that's basically like the basis of this project, which is like storytelling, collective storytelling can be like a powerful antidote to like stereotypes, fear, etc. And that's why I don't want this like podcast to be super negative or like sad. I simply want people to just hear stories and then learn more about the things that go on in our world today.
Yeah, it's not too different than, what I do as a career, right? I was like Lyft's head of North America, state and local government relations. I went to Cruise and I was their vice president of global government affairs. And what we often would talk about when we thought about public campaign strategies or public engagement strategies or putting together a political strategy was really the concept of, one, education, really fundamentally getting in front of policymaker and decision makers' faces and getting them to understand what the technology is about or what someone is trying to bring forth. And secondly, telling stories on how this could benefit people's lives. And the same way that you're pursuing this podcast is to open up different perspectives and to augment people's stories and to think about how we can effectuate change for the future. I really applaud you for doing it.
Thank you. And likewise, I especially admire how like you integrate all of these different skills into one mission, which is to like create change.
Yeah.
So
That's been the theme of my career, along with building and creating. It's been about effectuating change and the impact of them, particularly on communities and communities of color, marginalized communities. And, I think that is something that is, again, we think about a concept of seva, service to others, right? In the Indian world or in the Hindu world specifically. And I think that's something that we hold true in the community is how do we give back and how do we continue to impact people for the future.
Thank you so much
It
for a
was
great
such a pleasure.
conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you, likewise.